it's a funny old world, isn't it? Because obviously doing this for a living, the more confusing, complicated, even perhaps frenzied and passionate politics is, the easier my job becomes. And in many ways, the more I enjoy it. Don't tell the boss or any of the bosses that I told you this, but I don't think I earn my money on the days when there's loads and loads of news. They do. The only time you get, sent a bottle of champagne, or you get the old slap on the back when you come off air, or when major events have unfolded while we've been on air. So most recently it would be the passing of the Duke of Edinburgh, when it certainly feels as if the ears of the world are upon us. But I don't think I actually earn my money on those days, sort of post-election days, and days when the phones are ringing off the hook from 10 o'clock in the morning to 1 o'clock in the afternoon, days when we could do all 3 hours of the programme on the same subject. I think I earn my money on the days when there is no news. What are we going to do today? To steer your ship away from the really obvious stuff like parking tickets and is there anybody old out there feeling poorly, which is one of the great ways to get the switchboard to melt under the pressure of. It doesn't quite make me laugh as much as it used to when I first started sharing that little question, because I'm edging ever closer to the category that it mocks. But I think we do it on the days when there's hardly any news. So, be careful what you wish for, I suppose, underpins all of that. But I'm loving it at the moment, the never-ending avalanche of news. And indeed, we'll catch up with Theo Usherwood shortly about that thing I suggested to you earlier about Boris Johnson's prominence at the top of the list of MPs under investigation by Parliament's sleaze watchdog. Amazing how effectively. You see it on the front page of The Sun a fortnight ago. Oh, don't worry about the wallpaper. And then tiny voices like mine go, it's not about wallpaper. It's about the fact that Boris Johnson secretly secured funds from an unknown source. It doesn't matter what the funds were spent on. The principle here is the financial shenanigans. And why won't he tell us? But, stick it on the front of The Sun and it will be dead in the water in Hartlepool by tea time, as we have evinced, as we have witnessed. So 11:38 is the time. We'll get onto that with Theo shortly. But it's Labour that I want to look at next. One of the problems with Keir Starmer, I mentioned this last week, is that he doesn't have any stands. He doesn't have any super fans. Stan, of course, being a reference to Eminem's famous track of the same name, featuring the sample of Dido's rather lovely song, Tea's Gone Cold, I'm Wondering Why I've Woken Up. Yeah, anyway. So I don't think Keir Starmer has any stands. And conscious as I am how dispiriting it can be for conversations about Labour in 2021 to still focus upon the leader who led Labour to the worst defeat in living memory in 2019. Say what you like about Jeremy Corbyn, he was not short of superfans, fanatics. It's why the word cult sometimes popped up in the context of those conversations, although, as we've just done a couple of minutes upon the niceties of live broadcasting, I would advise you not to reach for that word very often. And if you don't know why, just ask Nicky Campbell next time you bump into him on your travels. So he doesn't have any superfans, he doesn't have any stands, and because the last fella has so many, there's a perception that somehow anybody who pointed out the failures or predicted the epic failures of the last Labour leader must somehow be a massive fan of the new one. I don't know where it comes from. I was thinking about it at the weekend. The toxicity I get from what you'd call Corbyn stands, I don't know I don't know if any of it is his fault. I have to be careful about this. So my retrospective analysis of Jeremy Corbyn shouldn't really be coloured by his superfans who spend their lives on social media being vile to everybody. Even more so, Labour voters who aren't perceived to be ideologically pure enough than actual Conservative voters. But I don't know how much responsibility Jeremy Corbyn bears for that. And in the great scheme of things, I don't care anymore. It doesn't matter. That ship has sailed. But I don't think there's much dispute about the fact that Keir Starmer doesn't really have superfans. The way that people talk about Boris Johnson, almost as if, well, I don't care about X, Y and Z, I just love him. And again, I'm qualified to do this, because while I never loved him, I certainly fell for it, going back best part of a decade and a half when he was running for mayor of London. I certainly fell for the kind of bonhomie, the bluster, the blokey demeanour. But I saw the light, which is how I can cling to the hope that other people will as well. But in Keir Starmer's case, there is no super fan. There's certainly, speaking entirely for myself, the idea that you would brook no criticism of Keir Starmer is patently ridiculous because there is so much room for it. And again, you have to forget about the last fella, because the number of people that would brook no criticism of him, despite the fact that there was way more room for criticism than there currently is with Keir Starmer, was just ridiculous. And you just get bogged down in ridiculousness if you spend too much time examining it. But he's had an absolute nightmare. The situation in Hartlepool, not his fault, particularly, because of the arithmetic mentioned to you before. Add the Conservative vote from 2019 to the Brexit Party vote, and you get the Conservative win that we saw in Hartlepool. But this absolute faff of a reshuffle at the weekend, I don't know how it happened. I tend not to mix or indeed break bread with politicians or their advisors, so I haven't got an inside line on this, and I haven't been able to speak to anybody who does. But it kind of got announced before the reshuffle had officially started that Angela Rayner was being removed from the party chair position. She can't be removed from the deputy leader position because that's elected by Labour members. Angela Rayner perceived, and again, problem number 206, Angela Rayner perceived as being from the left of the party. But if you were to speak to the average voter in Hartlepool, I don't think that they would be as well versed in the factionalism of the Labour Party as the Labour Party is. So, you know, your average punter is going to think Labour means left, not that, oh, well, there's that Labour and then there's that Labour, and, oh, Angela Rayner's really left and Keir Starmer's not, and this word centrist, which is possibly the most overused word in the vocabulary of the Corbyn stands, is not really a word that anybody else uses anymore. It's just yet more evidence of this absolute madness that the Labour Party routinely indulges in, while the Conservative Party gets on with the business of winning and keeping power, often regardless of the actual observable truth. So he's messed up this reshuffle. I don't know whether it will, when the dust settles, look like a good move. Rachel Reeves coming in as Chancellor. I thought Annalise Dodds, whenever I heard her being interviewed, and when I interviewed her myself, I thought she was really good. Shows what I know. She didn't get the recognition factor, apparently. She didn't land enough punches on Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak's been paying 7 million people's wages for the last 18 months. I don't know how you're supposed to land a punch on him. Seriously, it just seemed that if Keir Starmer can credit coronavirus with changing everything and therefore making some political observations a bit meaningless, how that doesn't also defend Annalise Dodds, I do not know. But again, I don't know what goes on behind the scenes. I don't know what their focus groups and their polling is telling them. I think it was probably a mistake to put a prominent Remain campaigner in place in Hartlepool, but Labour would probably argue that's moved on. We haven't committed to a second referendum. Keir Starmer has tried to put the ghost of Brexit to bed by simply saying, OK, that's what we're dealing with now. The Conservatives keep trying to reanimate the corpse because millions of people up and down the country are still labouring under the illusion that it's going to be a good idea, and that's the electoral reality that Keir Starmer has to deal with. So, what question to ask? You can't. It's no point asking what does the Labour Party stand for, because what does the Conservative Party stand for? The Conservative Party used to stand for business, family, all of the things that Boris Johnson has either publicly denigrated or privately corrupted. So, those old divisions don't really stand. I'm tempted to ask what you'd do if you were Keir Starmer. And then we come to the final piece of the jigsaw, which is this so-called culture war. There's no pleasure whatsoever in having seen it coming from 100 miles off. But what you have now is people saying, oh, yes, they just want to tear down statues and everybody's woke. And I tell you now, for the umpteenth time, if you ever sit in a radio or TV production office, the person in the room you're going to feel sorriest for is the person trying to find someone to come on the radio or the telly and call for statues of Winston Churchill to be pulled down. And yet somehow voters from Tower Hamlets to Hartlepool have got the idea that the Labour Party is populated by people that want to tear down statues of Winston Churchill. I don't think I've ever met one. and I'm one of the country's most prominent lefties, apparently. Of course, for your Corbyn superfans, I'm practically a fascist. And that is part of the problem, isn't it? The Labour Party is being defined by its enemies. It's being inaccurately defined. It's being ridiculously defined. But this is a government built upon the inaccurate and ridiculous definition of non-existent enemies. Originally Brussels, that's what got them into Downing Street, and now the so-called woke brigade, which doesn't mean anything. But if I tell you I'm going to protect you from these terrible, terrible people, if we've learned anything over the last few years, we've learned that 52% of the population isn't going to check whether there are actually any terrible people there. They're just going to say, thank you very much for protecting us, sir. Have my money and my vote. And that, I think, is Labour's essential problem now. It's impossible to get a handle on how big this, quotes, culture war, end quotes, is. I'm very conscious of not letting my inbox give me a disproportionate idea of its representation, but it's certainly the line that is being pushed. Everywhere from the dodgy think tanks to the tabloid newspapers, this is the line that is being pushed. The Labour Party want to tear down statues and denigrate our history by actually learning more about it. They don't. There's an actual Labour MP doing the rounds at the weekend talking about specifically this. If you come across him anywhere, ask him to name the Labour MPs that are in favour of pulling down statues of Winston Churchill, because there may well be a couple. But if I could pass those names on to colleagues charged with trying to find people to come on the radio and call for statues of Winston Churchill to be pulled down, I think I'd be doing them a favour. So what's the problem with Labour? 03456060973. I've got some thoughts of my own, but I'd rather hear yours first. If you don't ring me with yours, then I will inflict my thoughts upon you. Picking up on a point I made a moment ago, Nick Lowles is the CEO of Hope Not Hate, an anti-fascist campaign group that's done some incredible work over the last few years. And he suggests he describes something that I think plays into our conversation about the Labour Party, oddly. He goes, with Boris Johnson's pro-Brexit right-wing populist agenda, which includes strong anti-immigration messaging and deliberate manipulation and hyping of a cultural war, there is currently very little political space for traditional far-right parties obsessed with racial nationalism and Islamophobia. This is an explanation of why far-right groups and individuals did so badly in the polling last week. I, for the record, I completely agree with it. But, of course, the next stage is to portray the Labour Party as being the champions, if you like, of immigrants and Muslims and all of the constituencies, all of the communities that this analysis suggests Boris Johnson is wooing the enemies of. And that, you know, what's far right on a Monday can be quite mainstream by a Friday. So what does the Labour Party do, especially, unless you want to query this a bit of my analysis, especially given that the next stage of the Conservative assault upon truth has to be portraying the Labour Party or continuing or exaggerating or amplifying the portrayal of the Labour Party as being obsessed with statues and slavery, even though I'm not really aware of many front bench Labour politicians having much to say on either subject. There's also the point, of course, that I would normally think you'd want your politicians to care more about human beings than they do about statues, or indeed that the question you ask when you're looking at history or historical reports is not, do I want to hear it? The only question you should really ask is it true? But that's the nature of a, quotes, culture war, isn't it? 11:54 is the time. What do they need to do? What's going on? Kieran's in Dunstable. Kieran, what would you like to say?
Hiya. So I'm a Labour Party member, and a week back I went door knocking. Yeah. And the issue is that within our own Labour Party, we're completely afraid to mention our previous government. And so when we're on the doorstep and we're asking, and people are asking us, well, what has the Labour government ever done for us? We have to go back to like the 1970s to give examples. Why can't we talk about the most recent Labour government and say, look,
well, who tells you that you can't?
Growth ever.
Who tells you that you can't?
What do you mean?
Well, why can't you talk about Tony Blair and Gordon Brown?
Well, I do, but all my colleagues in the Labour Party, especially the local one, absolutely hate the last Labour government. And so they don't mention it.
So this is, again, despite my forlorn hopes that we would be able to steer clear of this particular iceberg, you're talking about a party that is roughly divided between people who think that they need to run a million miles away from the last leader, and people who still think that the last leader is some sort of unrecognised messiah.
I'm within the actual local Labour Party. I don't actually think it's split in the middle. I actually think that Labour Party members absolutely hate the last government. It was only Labour Party. There's a difference between Labour Party members and Labour Party voters. And Labour Party voters want to know what we can do for them. And we need to mention stuff we've done in the past. Yeah, minimum wage was a fantastic idea. That's not a Tory idea.
All sorts of things. And more so probably Gordon Brown's legacy than Tony Blair's. But this is the problem, isn't it, in a nutshell? And you describe it from the doorstep. People are more than welcome to disagree with you or to share their perspective from different doorsteps. I guess the problem then becomes what do you represent now? So I can see why, I don't know if you've seen the clip of the fella in Hartlepool claiming that he was going to vote Conservative for the first time and then just listing consequences of Tory austerity policies. It's quite heartbreaking. It's been lifted out of context as ever on social media, but the bulk of it is still heartbreaking. What's the offer that you make for the future rather than the reference that you make to the past? However frustrating it is that you have to that many of your co-campaigners don't want to reference the most recent past.
This is a very difficult one to answer because you also need to make now the distinction between the cultural left and the economic left.
Yes.
And unfortunately, up north, it's gone culturally right, but I think they're still economically left. So now we need to make a decision as to how do we incorporate.
Are you being a bit euphemistic when you say culturally? When you say culturally right, are we just talking about immigration?
Talking about being woke earlier.
We're talking about immigration, really, aren't we?
Yeah.
That's a shame.
And so I think we need to give an agenda that suggests that we can benefit both middle class people, which is the majority of the country. And if you actually look in the south in the last election, we made gains on all areas.
And there is some fascinating movements potentially on the horizon as London sucks in the educated professionals from all around the countries and then spews them into the southeast. Those former Tory strongholds are wavering. Even parts of the Cotswolds. I think possibly that. I know she didn't keep the seat, but when Labour won Kensington and Chelsea, it may have been a signifier that we didn't fully appreciate at the time. So, no, I hear you. That is part of the problem, and that leads us back to why would the Conservatives be so desperate to portray the Labour Party as obsessing about minorities and wanting to tear down statues of Churchill? Answer, because it works. Doesn't matter whether it's true or not. It works. Martin's in Swindon. Martin, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Yeah, thank you for having me on the show. Like your caller just then, I'm a Labour member and have been since I was a young adult, really. It's just in my late 30s now. I would suggest that the brand, the Labour brand, is kind of tarnished
or meaningless. It doesn't necessarily mean anything at the moment.
Sorry, say again. Sorry.
Does it mean much at the moment? The Labour brand.
I was supposed, and I would suggest that if you talk to, inverted commas, working class about Labour at the moment, I think they would, they wouldn't even reference Keir Starmer. I think they would reference Jeremy Corbyn. And I think they would reference 5 years of this far left movement that doesn't resonate at all with them. It doesn't resonate with the country at all. It's been rejected and rejected hard.
It wasn't even a far-left movement. I mean, policy-wise, this is part of the problem with letting the very sort of weirdly unpleasant superfans pollute the whole picture. Corbyn was an atrocious salesman, but the product was actually quite popular in polling. It wasn't a far-left product. It was a social democratic model. Sadly, people that thought the sun shone out of Corbyn's backside can fail to appreciate or even understand the importance of having a good salesman in the context of what your product is. So what does Starmer need to do then? Because he's not even in the Parliamentary Labour Party anymore. There's not a great deal more Keir Starmer can do to disassociate himself from the last regime.
Well, and I suppose that's an interesting thing. If you went back to 2015, 2016, Corbyn was put up by the the left wing of the Labour Party as their sort of token candidate. And
I don't want to talk about Jeremy Corbyn. Sorry. I want to talk about Keir Starmer. Okay. What does he need to do next is what I asked you.
Well,
and we're out of time, so do it in 10 seconds or never.
Yeah. So I would suggest that he needs to look at... You are right in saying some of those policies were popular, but a lot
needs to be a better salesman. I did warn you that we were short of time, and I am already a little late for this. We're seeking to solve the Labour Party's problems by 1 o'clock today, which is, I grant you, quite a big ask. And the main problem is, of course, the shadow cast by Jeremy Corbyn, or one of the main problems. And by that, I fully acknowledge the existence of plenty of people who think it's a very benign and positive shadow. But if half the party wants to run away as fast as they possibly can from the disaster of 2019 and the man responsible for it, and half of the party thinks it wasn't his fault at all, it was largely the fault of everyone who predicted it and explained why it was going to happen, that it happened, how the hell do you pick yourself up, dust yourself down and start all over again? And then, of course, this mess at the weekend, turning Angela Rayner into a human hokey-cokey. You put 1 foot in, you put 1 foot out, in, out, shake it all about. And it's so hard to keep up. I think she's still deputy leader, which isn't in Keir Starmer's gift. She's no longer chairman of the party. Instead, she's shadowing Michael Gove, which looks like a promotion when you consider that Annalise Dodds, who was Chancellor, the second most important member of the shadow cabinet, is now chairman of the party. But Angela Rayner got very upset, apparently, reportedly, and her team went into bat. So that's a leadership battle waiting to happen right there, right now. For the record, in purely shallow terms, personally, I suspect that a female leader with a northern accent would actually, in terms of optics as opposed to metrics, would be quite good for the Labour Party. And I used to say, I stopped saying it for a while, but I used to say that, I don't know why, I've never met the fella. I used to say I was suspicious of any man who spent as long doing his hair as Keir Starmer clearly did every morning. I don't know whether that was horribly unfair, but if you would look at exclusively at hair, Boris Johnson's deliberately dishevelled appearance, very consciously dishevelled appearance, seems to play rather better at the moment than Keir Starmer's brill-creamed, painstakingly coiffured Barnet. Anyway, shut up, James, and take some calls. All right, I will. 12:06. Stuart's in Kuala Lumpur. Stuart? How's the Labour Party doing in Malaysia?
Probably better than the UK, to be fair.
Go on.
So, I think my point is that what Jeremy Corbyn was doing is probably going to be the future of the Labour Party. Maybe not now, but give, a generation, 20, 30 years, with the changing demographics of the Tory party. I suppose the thing that they're an ageing voter. They're not going to be around for a lot longer. And this surge in the youth of the social democratic ideal, I think it's almost inevitable that it's actually going to happen.
Again, I appreciate it's your show as much as mine, and it's a little naive of me to want to have a conversation that perhaps doesn't immediately hark back to the last leader. Something about the combination of politics and radio phone-ins probably makes it inevitable. But you're saying that the worst electoral defeat in living memory should be the blueprint for the future of the Labour Party.
But I think, like you said...
Just focus on what I've just asked you. That is what you've rung in to say, all the way from Kuala Lumpur. The worst electoral defeat since 1935 has to be the roadmap ahead for Keir Starmer.
Maybe not for Keir Starmer, no. I think...
All right, for the Labour Party, then.
For the Labour Party, I think it is. But as I said...
listen to my words. The worst electoral defeat since 1935, that's definitely what we need more of.
As you said a few moments ago, it's got something to do with the salesman of it, I think.
Okay.
Corbyn was not a good salesman of this ideal. But I think somebody who can sell it...
Well, what ideal? Sorry to badger you, but I want substance. Because has Starmer abandoned much of that policy platform? I mean, what would you point at as the thing that is a brilliant product but just needs a better salesman?
I think he's always been in a very, very difficult situation. Following on from Corbyn, he's always going to be in an incredibly difficult situation. I mean, to be fair, he got a lot of young people involved in that vote, a huge amount. Does he have the power to do that? I don't think.
But you
I
haven't.
think
I
he's
mean,
more
with
sort of
respect, I'm asking for detail and substance, and you haven't got any, which is absolutely fine and very emblematic of the broader political picture. But you haven't got anything. Something that Starmer has abandoned, for example, that Corbyn promoted. Have you got that at your fingertips?
I mean, to be fair, this is coming from a staunch Conservative. You probably.
I don't care. I'm asking you a question.
I mean, certainly.
So a staunch Conservative rings in and says what the Labour Party needs to do is stick with the model that led them to the worst electoral defeat since 1935. And suddenly the cloud's clear, Stuart. You should have been a little bit more honest with my listeners from the beginning. Tim's on the Isle of Wight. Tim, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Good morning to you. Look, I think it's quite simple sorting out Labour's problems.
Go on then.
Look, throughout the whole of Europe, you have a modern social democratic party. You've got the Democrats in America. Why can't Labour just drop its past, this ridiculous sort of working class image and envy and of the rich, and just progress and just join the modern world? Look at Mrs. Merkel and people like that. Look at the whole of Scandinavia.
She's a right-wing politician, and the Democrats. Merkel is a right-wing politician. She's much closer to the Conservative Party than she is to the Labour Party.
She's not that right-wing, is she?
She categorically is, mate. I don't want to have an argument with you about it. It's just stick your head out the window and see whether it gets wet or not. And I think the Democrats in America, if it wasn't for the coronavirus, Trump probably would have got a second term.
Yeah, I know, but what I'm saying to you is, don't you think that the Labour Party does not represent now as a modern party?
No, I don't know what you mean by that, because what is it in Keir Starmer's performance as leader that lends itself to your analysis of class envy or
well, I'll tell you what lends me to that.
Yeah, go on.
Is that they're constantly...
No, Keir Starmer specifically. I don't want any platitudes.
I'm going to.
Good.
Constantly on television,
yes.
you have people like Diana Abbott.
No, she's not in the front bench.
I know, but it damages the image.
Yes, but we're having a conversation about Keir Starmer's leadership. I know lots of people don't like Diane Abbott. That's fine. That's why he hasn't given her a job on the front bench.
Keir Starmer's been a big disappointment to me. I think he's a very clever man. I don't think he's got a party. This is his problem.
I'm going to push you on this, because I just want you to give me examples of Keir Starmer subscribing to the school of thought that you describe.
Well,
because I don't think he does. I think he's tried his damnedest to actually move away from what you describe.
Well, he might have done, but what I'm saying is that he's very restricted by people like his like the deputy leader of the Labour Party being voted by the... What is it?
I think the Isle of Wight and Kuala Lumpur are not providing me with the glittering insights that I'm looking for. They may well not exist, Tim. So don't take that personally. I just don't know quite what you mean. It's not Keir Starmer's fault that the BBC decide to book Diane Abbott for a TV show. Is it?
Well, they're never going to get anywhere, Labour, under this. They're never going to get anywhere until they modernise.
And then you can see, again, modernise is a word that doesn't mean anything until you provide substance. You know, it's just it's another platitude. I might agree with some of your sentiments, but I need concrete descriptions. If the BBC decides to ring up Diane Abbott to canvass her reactions, and it alienates voters like you, it's going to frustrate Keir Starmer even more than it frustrates you, I imagine. I don't know. I've never spoken to the man. Not because he refuses to, by the way, like the last bloke. Just because we've never got around to it. And Ferrari got dibs on the regular phone-in programme. 12 minutes after 12 is the time. Tony's in Camden. Tony, what's going on?
Well, fundamentally, the Labour Party is not speaking to its core support that have supported them during the previous successful government that happened back in '97. You know, and I mean, I know you don't want to talk about the previous leader.
No, I don't mind. I don't mind. I just don't think it's going to provide Starmer with much.
I've been a Labour member since 1997, and I come from a very lower working class background. Ironically, the previous neighbourhood that I used to live in is Keir Starmer's neighbourhood where he lives now. I also used to go to the same secondary school as Ed Miliband. Okay. So just to put it into context. I'm not going to bang on about who I am and what you know, my. But let's put it this way: I come from an immigrant background. My parents were first generation Greek Cypriots, and they experienced racism growing up. So late, and they were hard, lower working class people, and they were. My mum was a staunch Labour supporter through and through.
But here's the thing, Tony, and we're short of time, so I really would love you to respond to this.
Phillips, Clive Lewis, David Lammy. We need people.
Okay, but here's what I hear on other people's programmes. I tend not to get these calls myself so much anymore, but I'm working on it, trying to create a safe space. I hear people saying, I'm sick to death of hearing about racism. I'm sick to death about hearing about minorities. When is the Labour going to party?
I do too.
Right.
I do too. That's why there's only been 3 Labour Prime Ministers since the Labour Party's creation since 1900. The reason being is this country is fundamentally, and we've got to come to terms with it, the Labour Party has to come to terms with it, is that it is very right-wing. Embrace it. Embrace the nationalism. Okay, embrace nationalism.
But doesn't that give rise to more of? Doesn't that give rise to more of the sentiment that your parents endured when they first came here?
But this is the thing, though, James. The reason why I'm using this as a euphemism. The reason why Carl, a panel beater from Wigan, is not voting for the Labour Party.
Yes,
because the Labour Party doesn't believe in someone like Carl, a panel beater from Wigan, anymore.
Yes, I don't understand how embracing the further extremities of right-wing cultural issues would reverse the progress that's been made in the treatment of people like your parents. I think you've touched on something that's crucial, the either-or nature of it. Somehow the perception is that this lot care more about him and her over there than they do about me. And I think that is a problem. I don't think it's a problem that Keir Starmer's creating. And I wouldn't lay it entirely at the feet of the last fella either. Miliband tried to steer it and ended up really making a fool of himself. It's a really, really tricky one. And you go right back to Gordon Brown calling that woman a bigot on the footage that he didn't realise was still being recorded. And I think that is a problem. But the problem the Labour Party have is that they can care about both. They can make a case for immigration while simultaneously looking after Carl, the panel beater in Wigan. But I don't know why maybe it's the media again. They can't find the space in which they're free or capable of, or able to do it. Thank you, mate. It's got a touch, and I say this cautiously, it's got a touch of the when did you stop beating your wife question, hasn't it? If the Conservative Party continue to very, very successfully portray the Labour Party as being concerned only about oppressed minorities and niche issues, how do they prove that they're not, without at least initially accepting the premise that they are? There you go. It's a question for the ages. Crikey, it's done it again. I'm going to stop doing this. Keith, get another tin, will you? I have to stop saying I can't believe how much time has passed since we came on air. It's getting very tired. It's getting very boring. Elizabeth, the second Elizabeth of the day. There you go. At least one of us is paying attention. Is in Harrogate. Elizabeth, back to the Labour Party. What do they need? What's going on?
Well, I think they need to get down and play dirty like the Tories, because Starmer is a very decent man. He's got a lot of integrity. I personally wanted Emily Thornberry because I'd seen her take Boris Johnson to task on a few occasions. And I just think that Starmer is too nice, basically. I mean, for instance, recently Boris sent ships over to Jersey because a French minister had talked about turning off the electricity. Why didn't the Labour Party come back strongly about the Tories selling off all our utilities? I mean, I
don't know if that would necessarily have landed, but the broader point holds, doesn't it? If not, in my view, that particular example. Emily Thornberry's a wonderful example, actually, because regardless of her merits, she will be. They have hung that tweet around her neck when she tweeted a photograph of a house, I think in Essex, that had some fairly grubby England flags of St George. I'm sure they weren't grubby when they were put up, dangling outside in a white van in the doorway, in the driveway. And she tweeted that without comment. I think people read into it that she was expressing disapproval either of the decor or the sentiments that it expressed. And there we should have seen one of the seeds of the so-called culture war. So it doesn't matter what Emily Thornberry does, what she believes, what she says, how effective she is, how honest she is. Anymore, to go back to our previous example, Diane Abbott once drank a mojito on a train and got her sums a bit wrong in this studio with Nick one time, and that gets hung around their neck in a way that Conservative politicians simply don't suffer from. It's quite bizarre.
I know, but as I say, that's because Tory politicians play very dirty. I mean, they're still banging on about Liam Burns.
Yes, they are, and they pretend not to know that when Liam Byrne left that note for saying there isn't any money left, not only was he joking, but he was also referencing, I think, a sort of relatively common practice in parliamentary circles that had previously been undertaken by Tories as well, I think. But what would playing dirty look like? Because if they both start lying, then you're going to struggle to persuade me that two wrongs make a right.
Well, I don't think it's lying, saying that, they sold off all the utilities and this taking back control is ridiculous because we've sold everything off. I mean, at the weekend there was something about the trains that have been supplied by Hitachi, have got cracks in them. Why are we buying trains from Japan? Why has the Tory government, again, sold off the railways, made a mess, and we're buying trains from Japan? Trains used to be able to be built in this country.
Yeah, but there will be... you could find a factory that's shut under a Labour government, I'm sure, quite easily. I hope you don't mind, but I take your central point more than I take your examples, and that's Starmer's problem. I don't think he would have buttered any political parsnips if he'd stood up while the gunboats were heading to Jersey and started talking about railway contracts or even selling off the utilities. I don't think it would have mattered. There is a strong line in there somewhere about state ownership, and the Conservatives are supposed to be opposed to state ownership of utilities, but they seem perfectly comfortable with it when it's a foreign state that owns our utilities. But that doesn't land, and this is where I now veer into the territory that is often described as being condescending or sneering, because I'll say voters don't really care about that. They care more about flags and statues. Here's an example. You mentioned Emily Thornberry. Someone listening to the same programme that you're listening to texts in, flag-hating bigot Emily Thornberry, you mean? And that's all it takes, you see. It's so dispiriting sometimes to see how easily people are led into positions of such... Well, choose your words carefully, otherwise you become part of the problem. They're led into positions of such... idiocy. Condescending, sneering radio host calls Patriot idiot. See? It's so easy. It almost makes you wish you were a Tory. And how can they end up with so many complete turnips on the round? Nadine Dorries has a position in this government. It's so easy to play this game. How have they ended up with so many people that still are so rubbish at it? Now, Jake's in Northampton. Back to the Labour Party, Jake. What would you like to say?
Yeah, I just think, I think part of the reason for the failure of this opposition is that they just haven't taken responsibility, a lot of them, both in the centre and the left, for their role in the kind of 2019 catastrophe. Of course it was Corbyn's incompetence, but it was also, I think, the second referendum policy, which so many of them, a lot of them in Leave constituencies, championed. And they all none of them, I've ever heard them say, it was my bad, I made a mistake championing that. Well,
they don't think they did make a mistake, but Starmer, who's the leader, has very much put them into the cold. Not all of them, probably, but the most prominent one, who would you say? I'd probably say Hilary Benn. He's not...
Yeah, or Yvette Cooper, but there was talk over the weekend of them being...
Yeah, but that can't explain why they did badly in Hartlepool. He's done exactly what you wanted him to do, which is to keep the second referendum campaigners at arm's length. So it can't be that, can it?
Though, because he was, in a way, the architect, though, of the second referendum, wasn't he? And then the fact that the guy who was the architect of that policy that alienated so many former Labour voters, then all of a sudden, gets the top job. I know.
Well, then he's damned if he does and he's damned if he doesn't, because I come at it from the other angle. I wish he'd start actually pointing out the truth about free ports and about fishing and about farming and about Jersey and all the things that Starmer has decided it's not worth relitigating. But you say even if he pursues that path, he keeps Yvette Cooper on the backbenches, he keeps Hilary Benn in the cold, and he refuses to relitigate Brexit or to call for a return to the European. He's trying to put it on ice. He's trying to kill it off, and he can't. He can't kill it off. You're saying because the party is still associated with the second referendum.
Yeah, I think because also it makes him look like he doesn't really believe in anything because.
How can he go? How can he go from passionately wanting the British public to have a second vote when they actually knew what Brexit might look like, to pretending that it's not even in his thinking at all?
Yeah.
Oh man, that's tough.
I think that then carries on onto the fact that the Tories have to carry this nonsense narrative that all Labour care about is trans rights and statues.
But you and I find it nonsensical. It works, doesn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, if Labour fought that and said, no, that's not what we, there's only been one statue that's been torn down. That was in Bristol by a bunch of young people. It wasn't Labour MPs tearing it down, was it?
No, and as I say, and I'll say it, I mean, until I'm blue in the face, or until it ceases to be true, I tell you what, you would not want to be charged with finding somebody to come on the radio and call for statues of Winston Churchill to be pulled down. They're as rare as hen's teeth.
If you had a Labour Party, if they actually believed in something passionate, and whatever for all of Corbyn's ills, he was passionate. He said what he believed what he said. So if you had a leader who was passionate about stuff, who would actually fight on his terms, but instead kind of...
We all say similar things, don't we? We all want him to land more punches, but we're not quite sure what those punches are going to look like, and that is... grounds for some sympathy for his position, or perhaps for some patience, I don't know. But again, of course, the debate about Keir Starmer's leadership is odd, and it's slightly restricted because so much of it's still defined by the last leader, and the fact that you can almost, if you were to criticise Keir Starmer, it becomes in the minds of some very, very strange people, it becomes proof that your criticisms of Jeremy Corbyn must have been wrong. It's quite bizarre, isn't it? You say, well, I'm not that impressed by Keir Starmer. Well, then perhaps you should have been more careful in your criticisms. That can be right then and right now. It's kind of my trademark. Chris is in Tower Hamlets. Chris, what would you like to say?
Yeah, morning, James. The woman who was on earlier on nearly got it right, although she was saying about, they need to be down and dirty.
Yes, just to clarify on that, Hitachi trains are actually assembled in County Durham, I think. Hitachi Newton Aycliffe, isn't it? So just, slight clarification.
No, but I was going to say, I don't think they do need to get dirty, but they do need to fight back. And that has been an eternal problem now for years. We don't have a leader of the Labour Party who's a proper fighter.
He's a bit bloodless, isn't he, Keir Starmer? He's a bit bloodless.
I mean, look at what they're doing now. I'm, and you can imagine the frustration, James. I'm a Labour Party member for about 40 years. I've written to successive leaders saying to them, why aren't you saying this? Why aren't you doing that? Never get a single reply, apart from Ed Miliband, who I taught A-level English when he was at school. Gosh. He did at least have the decency to ring me up. And,
was he any good?
No, it didn't make a blind bit of difference. Oh, he was very good. But it didn't make a blind bit of difference. They still didn't articulate the cause properly.
So what would be your... I mean, we're late already, so what would be your to-do list? What would be your three-point plan then?
So, every time Boris Johnson stands up and says, we're going to have to sort out the waiting list in the NHS caused by COVID, Starmer's got to say, no, stop right there. They aren't just been caused by COVID. The waiting lists were going up dramatically before COVID was even thought of under Tory austerity. The only time waiting lists went down was when Tony Blair was Prime Minister and Gordon Brown was Chancellor of the Exchequer. The attainment gap between, children from disadvantaged backgrounds, the only time that attainment gap has closed in our history was under Labour policies and Labour funding. It was dramatically opening up again years before the COVID pandemic. But do you ever hear Keir Starmer saying this?
I heard you. Well, in a way, though, and I know I'm marking the homework very, very stringently today. In a way, though, you are still saying that you can fight untruth with truth. And all of the recent political movements in this country suggest that for now we're in a period of history where the opposite is true. The people who aren't telling the truth are doing brilliantly well. Even Priti Patel's scheme to send asylum seekers, if their applications fail, back to other countries. This weekend it was reported every single other country has said, yeah, jog on, mate. But of course the policy was never announced with the likelihood of it becoming law. It was announced solely to get headlines from the right-wing media and to get approval from people who seem to care more about statues than they do about people. So, the truth of that policy proposal is it was completely pie in the sky. But by the time the truth has got his trousers on, the lie is halfway around the world. This from the FT yesterday, I think. An exodus of EU lorry drivers from the UK since Brexit has left the British haulage and logistics industry facing an acute staff shortage and a looming crisis for industrial and retail deliveries. This is a warning from the sector, not from any politicians. It's the Logistics UK, it's called now, isn't it? It used to be the Freight Transport Association. Here is their policy manager. Britain has had a chronic driver shortage for many years, but the problem is now acute. In 10 years of campaigning on this issue, we've never seen members as concerned as they are now. I'm not going to check my inbox. I shall invent the text that's coming. Well, good. Then we can give them to British people. We can have British lorry drivers. So I'll respond by reading you that bit again. Britain has had a chronic driver shortage for many years, but the problem is now acute. Why can't we train our own? Britain has had a chronic driver shortage for many years, but the problem is now acute. Well done, everybody. 12:51 is the time. Martin is in Sheffield. Martin, what have you got?
Hi, James. I just think we need a combination of Blair or Obama-style charisma mixed with mainly policies that were under Corbyn's administration.
And Miliband, actually. So it was similar products, new salesmen. Like who?
Well, yeah, I'm a bit short on that one.
Sorry, that was just a bit of a barked laugh there, but I wasn't expecting you to be so honest so quickly.
Well, you didn't say we needed a foolproof plan. You just said, come up with some ideas.
A cunning plan would be enough, I think, in the current circumstances, wouldn't it?
I think if you're going to try and own the centre ground, you need charisma to get it over the line, or it's just not going to... What happened with Hillary? Clinton, it just doesn't work if you've not got the charisma to pull it off.
And charisma's a tricky word, isn't it? Charisma is, we think of it as a positive, but actually very negative people or very dangerous people can have charisma. In fact, arguably the most dangerous people in the world have had bags of charisma, haven't they?
Yeah, I think, that's correct. But I think, like Corbyn's policies were popular when people were polled on the policies and took the man out of the equation. Yeah. Everyone thought they were a winner. So that combination, I think, has got to be the way.
Yeah, those online quizzes as well about where you would sit politically if you answer a succession of questions about what you want to happen. And people are usually very surprised to discover that they're a lot closer to the so-called left than they are to where they think they reside, which is, once again, at the risk of sounding like a stuck record, that is why it's so important to the Conservatives to keep these culture war flags flying, both figuratively and literally. Arguments about reality, I just mentioned the haulage industry there in passing. Arguments about reality don't suit their agenda. Arguments about mythical threats to stone representations of long-dead humans, that's the battlefield they want to be on. I would say, at 12:54, having not given big answers to these questions yet, that should be Starmer's. Somehow he has to get off that battlefield. But how do you get off that battlefield without being on it in the first place? And if you're on it in the first place, then you inflate the ludicrous definition of the Labour Party as being obsessed with what they now call woke, which is the same as politically correct or anti-racist or whatever version of that word you want to pick from the last 30 years of largely Rupert Murdoch-led assaults upon observable reality in this country. Nick's in Harrow. Nick, what would you like to say? What do you think might help or work?
Hi, James. I think one thing which is really important, I think Starmer has got a good ability to ask the right questions. But unfortunately, in democracy, you need the opposition to be able to ask the right questions and the Prime Minister to be accountable to those questions. And I don't think the Speaker of the House does a good job. He just lets the Prime Minister over and over again just spout out some rubbish that doesn't answer anything that he's been asked about. And
but he doesn't, though. Again, so I'm jumping in on everyone today, but at least I'm an equal opportunities interrupter. There's not a great deal he can do. It's Johnson's almost unprecedented disregard for decency and the truth, coupled with the simple rules that the Speaker has to obey. There's not a lot more Starmer can do when Johnson refuses to answer his questions.
No, that's fair. But I think there's a certain tone that can be set about in the Commons, a bit, which allows at least for some questions to be. You've got to be pressed occasionally to say, just answer that question, because I know there are. It has.
He's
to be very hands-off.
He's a really good lawyer. That's the one bit that arguably he has got covered. It just doesn't feel like it's landing with you. I mean, would you go in the same time, chuck away the script and just say, I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Speaker, but I am going to ask the Prime Minister the same question again until he answers it? If you did that every week for a month, it would begin to make inroads. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud.
I think he's tried that a few times where he kept on pressing and it hasn't worked.
I know.
But I do think it becomes, we are in a really dangerous time, as you say, where truth really does.
Well, you think that, and I think that, but there's tens of thousands of people in Hartlepool who think that everything's going great guns, everything's going brilliantly.
Yes, and until, well, as I say, and there's no other platform where he will hide in every other platform. He hasn't hidden in the Commons because he knows he can get away with it.
Yeah, and that's why he got so angry last time out. But it butters precisely no parsnips in the broader political spectrum. Many would argue, inevitably, Marina Hyde has written a superb piece about the dangers of thinking that PMQs is representative. I probably contribute to that problem, don't we, by broadcasting it live on the programme every week. I don't know that it matters much outside the so-called bubble. 12:57 is the time. Geraldine's in Waltham Forest. Geraldine, what would you like to say?
Well, I'm a Labour supporter, and I watch Prime Minister's Question Time every week. And when I see Keir Starmer, I actually would not get him to keep asking the same question, because he asked the same question which doesn't get replied. I would just remark, okay, you're not going to answer that question again, but every time he exposes something about Johnson, for example, so I would go back, right, so the 37 billion that have been wasted on track and trace. Yeah. You know, for example, 10 hospitals where something
where
that
are
relates
they?
directly.
Where are these hospitals you promised?
Not only where are they, but this is what could have been done, and this would have saved so many people. We could have trained nurses while you're decorating your flat.
Geraldine, here's the problem. Here's the problem, if I may. He's made all of these points, but they haven't landed, and yet you began.
He keeps. No, he doesn't, because he keeps asking the same question.
I'm not.
And I think
he has made all of these points. I mean, this isn't.
I think as well.
Hang on a minute, because we're all championing reality and truth. He's made all of the points that you described.
Okay, but
so hang on. So you're saying he should probably make them more, and at the same time, you're saying he should stop repeating himself.
No, but he should use the opportunity to bring his policies, and I think he should mock Johnson a lot more and playing him at his own game.
I agree with the last bit. He should try to make him into a laughing stock.
And say, you are not patriotic, because while you're selling off all the assets and wasting the 30s, so he should do the exact opposite and say, we are more patriotic than you.
Oh, Lord.
Because of this.
My flag's bigger than your flag. My flag's bigger than your flag, except hopefully move it more into substance than symbols. Geraldine, I have to go.